Deputy Miller smelled the bread before he saw the cabin. The scent was impossible, a phantom of warmth in a world frozen solid. For 2 days, his world had been the shriek of the wind and the punishing bite of a cold so profound it felt personal, a physical malice aimed at every living thing. At 40 below, the air didn't just chill you, it stole the heat from your bones, cracked your skin, and froze the moisture in your lungs with every breath. He'd just come from the Hemlock Place, where the silence had been absolute. He'd found them in their beds, a family of turned-to porcelain statues under their quilts, the fire in their hearth a mound of black ice. Before that, the Connolly farm, where the old man had survived but his hands and feet were black with frostbite, his words a senseless mumble about a frozen pump handle. Every stop on his route through the valley was a new verse in the same hymn of tragedy. So when the scent of yeast and baking flour cut through the sterile, knife-edged air, he thought his mind was failing him, conjuring ghosts of comfort. He pulled his scarf down, the wool frozen stiff against his beard, and tasted the air again. It was real. A thread of wood smoke, thin but steady, rose from the stone chimney of the cabin ahead, a structure half buried in a drift that curled over its roof like a great white wave. This was the last stop, the one he dreaded most. The Brandt sisters. The whole territory had talked about them. Twin sisters, barely 20, who'd come to work their dead parents' abandoned claim. They were substantial women, built on a scale that invited whispers and cruel jokes, and their methods were even stranger. Instead of a proper iron stove, they'd spent the autumn building some monstrous thing of clay and rock in the center of their small cabin. People called it the mud oven or Brandt's folly. The land agent, Finch, had openly predicted they'd be the first to perish. Miller had prepared himself for what he would find, a door blocked by snow, a final, frozen silence within. He expected to find 2 bodies, large and still, a testament to folly and pride. The smell of fresh bread was a profound and terrifying contradiction. It spoke of life, of normalcy, of a fire burning hot and true in the heart of an impossible cold. He pushed forward, his snowshoes sinking, his heart hammering a rhythm of dread and disbelief against his ribs. The warmth of the imagined bread felt more cruel than the wind. He shouldered the door, expecting it to be sealed by ice, but it swung inward with a surprising lack of resistance. The first thing that hit him was not the sight, but the feeling. It was a wave of dense, radiant warmth, so fundamentally different from the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove that it stopped him on the threshold. It was a living warmth, the heat that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards, from the air itself. His eyes, accustomed to the blinding white of the blizzard, took a moment to adjust. In the center of the single room stood the folly, a massive, smoothly plastered structure of pale clay that rose almost to the ceiling. It wasn't just an oven, it was a series of connected benches and surfaces, all radiating that same impossible, steady heat. And tending to it were the Brandt sisters, Marta and Lena. They were as large as the rumors had described, their frames solid and powerful, but there was no panic in their movements. Lena was sliding a long-handled peel from the mouth of the hearth, a perfectly browned loaf of bread resting on its surface. Marta was ladling soup into bowls for a small crowd of people huddled on the warm clay benches. Miller recognized them instantly. There was the Madsen family, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. There was Preacher Davis, his usual fire and brimstone certainty replaced by a quiet, shivering humility. There were 3 children from a neighboring homestead, wrapped in blankets, their eyes wide. A large, brindle-colored dog with a graying muzzle thumped its tail against the floor. The floor itself was warm beneath Miller's frozen boots. It was the most unnatural and miraculous thing he had ever felt. Marta looked up and saw him, her expression calm, unsurprised. "Deputy," she said, her voice even. "Close the door. You're letting the cold in. There's soup if you're hungry to understand the warmth in that room, the impossible bread, the quiet survival. You have to go back 6 months, to a different kind of cold." It was the cold of a house entered by loss. Their father had gone first, a fever burning through him in 3 short days. Their mother, a woman who had seemed as immovable as the hills, simply faded in the weeks that followed, as if her spirit had been tethered to his. On her last evening, she had pressed a worn, leather-bound notebook into Marta's hands. Her voice was a dry whisper. "Don't sell the book. And don't sell the high meadow claim. Go there. Your great-grandmother's hands are in that soil. The clay holds the heat. It was the last thing she ever said. They buried their mother next to their father and sold what little was left in the rented town plot, keeping only the tools, the wagon, their dog Barrow, and the notebook. The journey to the high meadow was a slow, rattling affair, a procession of two young women whose grief was a quiet, heavy blanket over everything they did. They were twins, but unalike in their sorrow. Lena's grief was practical, expressed in the tight set of her jaw and the fierce way she handled the draft horses. Marta's was internal, a deep stillness that made her seem distant, her focus already turned toward the words in the notebook. At the territorial office, they met Land Agent Finch. He was a small, precise man with a ledger for a soul, his gaze flicking over their robust figures with a dismissive air. He saw two orphaned girls, oversized and unsuited for the harsh realities of frontier life. He saw an abandoned claim he'd already mentally earmarked for the railroad survey, a quick and profitable transaction once the land reverted to the territory. "It's a hard parcel," he said, his tone a mixture of feigned concern and official warning. "Poor timber, rocky soil. Your father never could make a go of it. You have until the spring thaw to prove the claim. If it's found unimproved or abandoned after the winter, he let the threat hang in the air." He made a formal entry in his logbook, a neat, spidery script predicting their failure. Privately, he gave them 6 weeks. The cabin on the claim was little more than a derelict shell, chinked with mud that had crumbled away, leaving gaping wounds for the wind to tear through. The hearth was a collapsed pile of fieldstone, its chimney choked with debris. For the first few nights, they slept in the wagon, huddled together with Barrow for warmth, the vast, indifferent silence of the high meadow pressing in on them. Lena, ever the pragmatist, saw only the impossible labor ahead. "We'll freeze before the first snow," she said, her breath pluming in the crisp air. Marta, however, was looking at the ground. She crumbled a piece of the yellowish soil between her fingers. It was dense, greasy. It was clay. She looked from the soil in her hand to the notebook clutched in the other, and for the first time since their mother's death, a flicker of something other than sorrow sparked in her eyes. It was the hard, flinty glint of purpose. That night, by the light of a flickering lantern, Marta opened the book. The script was German, dense and angular, the ink faded to a soft brown. It was her great-grandmother's journal, a record not of feelings, but of work. Of a life lived in a colder, older country. It spoke of building a cachalophon, a masonry heater, a great beast of clay and tile that lived in the heart of the home. The language was not technical but sensory. "The fire is not the heat," she had written. "The fire is the memory. You feed the fire for a short time, a hot, fast burn. The fire dies, but the clay remembers. The clay holds the heat for a day and a night." Marta read the passages aloud to Lena, translating the strange, poetic instructions. It described a labyrinth of channels within the heater's mass, designed to snake the hot gases back and forth, extracting every last ounce of warmth before they escaped up the chimney. Stop here for a moment. Think about the simple physics of it. An iron stove gets blazing hot, very fast. It heats the air around it. But when the fire dies, the iron cools just as quickly, the heat dissipating into the room and then, just as fast, through the walls and into the cold outside. This was different. This was about thermal mass. The principle is simple: dense materials like clay, soapstone, or brick absorb and store heat energy slowly, and they release it slowly. The design described in the notebook was an incredibly efficient heat exchange system, a thermal battery made of earth. It wasn't just a fireplace, it was a piece of slow, deliberate engineering, perfected over centuries of cold winters. Before they could build, they had to prepare. The sisters worked with a singular, synchronized focus. Lena, with her greater physical strength, dug the new root cellar, her shovel biting into the earth day after day until they had a deep, cool space, lined with stone and timber. They filled it methodically, 100-pound sacks of flour and cornmeal, barrels of salted pork and cured hams, crates of potatoes and onions from their final trip to town, endless jars of beans, peas, and preserved fruits they'd bought for a pittance at the end of the market season. Their large bodies, so often a source of mockery, were engines of immense power and endurance. They worked from sunup to sundown, their appetites fueling the long hours of labor. They were storing energy in the cellar, and in themselves. While Lena dug and hauled, Marta began the meticulous process of preparing the clay. She found the best deposit by the creek bed, a rich, yellow vein she tested by feel, just as the book described. For weeks, the clearing echoed with the rhythmic, wet slap of their shovels and the squelch of their boots as they mixed the raw clay with sand and chopped straw in a giant pit, churning it with their feet until it reached the perfect consistency. It was grueling, repetitive work that stained their hands and clothes and caked in their hair. It was during this period that the visitors began to arrive, a slow procession of the valley's curiosity and doubt. The first was Mrs. Gable, the town's primary purveyor of gossip, who arrived under the guise of welcome, a small basket of dry biscuits in her hand. "Oh, you poor dears," she'd clucked, her eye scanning the muddy pit and the half-dismantled cabin. "All alone out here. It's hardly proper. And this project. Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Marta simply nodded, her hands covered in wet clay. "We know." The next was Preacher Davis, who saw the strange, foreign design taking shape and felt a prickle of spiritual unease. He stood at a safe distance, his Bible held tight in his hand. "The Lord provides for his flock through proven means," he intoned, gesturing vaguely at where a traditional hearth should be. To rely on strange methods, on ways brought from other lands, it can be a door for unwelcome influences. Lena, her patience worn thin, leaned on her shovel. "Preacher, we're building a fireplace, not summoning a demon. It'll be cold soon." The final skeptic was a young farmhand named Ben, whose doubt was loud and performative. He rode by with his friends, reining his horse in to laugh at the sight of the two large women covered in mud, wrestling the foundation stones into place. "I'll wager $20 they're starved out or frozen solid by Christmas," he shouted to his companions, who hooted in agreement. $20 says this mud pile collapses and buries them both." The sisters didn't look up. They just kept working, their silence a more profound answer than any argument. The wet slap of clay against stone was the only reply he received. Not everyone came to mock. One afternoon, an old man walking the trade road paused, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. He watched them for a long time, his gaze knowing. He was Ulrich, a German immigrant who kept to himself on a small plot down the valley. He walked over, not to the sisters, but to the hearth itself. He ran a wrinkled hand over the curve of the half-finished clay bench. "My grandfather had one," he said, his voice thick with the accent of his homeland. "In the old country. It kept us warm through the black winters." He nodded once, a gesture of profound, unspoken validation, and continued on his way. A week later, another traveler stopped, this one a master mason named Gregor, who had heard talk in town of the mud oven. He was from the same region as their great-grandmother, and when he saw the intricate flue plan Marta had sketched out in the dirt, he stopped dead. He recognized the design, the specific signature of the spiral draft. "This is the work of the House of Brandt," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "Your ancestor, she was a legend. Her ovens are still used. They are works of art." He saw a small flaw in their plan for the chimney damper, a slight inefficiency that could cause smoke to backdraft. He spent 2 days with them, not offering charity, but professional collaboration. He showed Lena how to properly seat the flue tiles, his calloused hands guiding hers. A quietness grew between them, an unspoken understanding built on the shared language of competent work. They spoke little, but his eyes would follow her as she effortlessly lifted a heavy stone, and she would watch his hands as he expertly troweled the mortar. From his own property line, their nearest neighbor, Mr. Madsen, watched the construction with a hard, bitter skepticism. He was a man hollowed out by grief. 5 years prior, he had lost his youngest son, a boy of 6, to a blizzard just like the one that was now gathering its strength in the high country. The boy had wandered from the barn to the house, a distance of no more than 50 yards, and had been swallowed by the whiteoat. They'd found him the next day, a frozen shape just feet from the porch. To Madsen, winter was not a season, it was a predator. And this strange mud pile seemed to him a foolish, arrogant taunt to that beast. His distrust was a shield for his pain. The day they finished, the air was still and cold, the sky a vast, empty blue. The hearth stood in the center of their home, a pale, monolithic sculpture of clay. It was smooth to the touch, and cool. Following the book's instructions, they loaded the firebox with a small, precise amount of dry wood and lit it. The fire caught quickly, roaring in the enclosed space. For 2 hours, it burned with a ferocious intensity, a contained dragon in the belly of the beast. Then, as instructed, they sealed the firebox and the chimney damper, starving the embers of air. The fire died. An hour passed. Marta, her heart pounding, placed her palm against the clay wall of the main bench. It was barely warm. Lena's face fell. All that work, for nothing. Wait, Marta whispered, her eyes on the book. Another hour crept by. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Marta touched the bench again. This time, a definite, deep warmth radiated into her palm, a heat that felt as if it were coming from the core of the earth. She pressed her cheek against the smooth surface. It was like leaning against a sun-baked rock in high summer. A slow smile spread across her face, the first true smile since her mother's death. The clay holds the heat, she said, the words a reverent exhalation. In the weeks that followed, an unseasonable warmth settled over the valley, a full spring that lulled the territory into a false sense of security. Then, overnight, the world changed. The temperature plummeted. The sky turned the color of lead. The first snowflakes fell, thick and heavy, and within hours, the wind began to howl, a rising, malevolent shriek that stripped the last leaves from the aspens and scoured the frozen ground. The storm that the old-timers would later call the Great White Death had arrived. Inside their cabin, the sisters fired the hearth once in the morning and once in the evening. The rest of the day, the house was filled with a silent, pervasive, life-giving warmth. Outside, the blizzard raged, erasing the world. On the second day, the snow was so deep it blocked the lower half of their single window. The wind was a physical force, shaking the stout log walls. The world outside had vanished into a vortex of driving snow. Visibility was less than 5 feet. Lena, worried about the tether holding the lean-to door shut, decided to check it. "I'll only be a moment," she said, pulling on her heavy coat. She wrapped a scarf around her face and stepped outside, attached to the house by the thick rope they had rigged for exactly this purpose. But the sheer, disorienting violence of the storm was more than she had bargained for. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, and the snow was a blinding, suffocating wall. She took 3 steps and was utterly lost, the cabin disappearing behind her as if it had never been. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She tugged on the rope, but her mittened hands were clumsy, her mind reeling. Inside, Marta counted to 60 and then 60 again. Lena should have been back. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She grabbed her own coat and followed the rope line out into the white chaos, calling her sister's name. The wind ripped the words from her mouth. Barrow, the dog, began to bark frantically from the doorway, a steady, piercing sound. It was the barking that saved them. Marta followed the sound of her own voice echoing back from the void, and then, a faint answer. She found Lena floundering in a drift not 10 yards from the door, her face already rimed with ice, her eyes wide with terror. Marta hauled her back inside, slamming the door against the screaming wind. She stripped Lena of her frozen outer layers and sat her on the warmest part of the clay bench, wrapping her in blankets and pressing a hot mug of broth into her trembling hands. Barrow curled at her feet, a living furnace. Hours later, as the storm reached its peak, a new sound penetrated the howl of the wind, a desperate, frantic pounding on the door. Marta opened it to find a figure encrusted in snow, a human icicle. It was Mr. Madsen. He stumbled inside, collapsing onto the warm floor, his face a mask of frozen despair. "My fire is out," he gasped, his words cracking. "The wood is wet. My wife, my boy," they're freezing. His carefully built wall of bitter pride had been obliterated by the storm. He was just a father, terrified of losing what little he had left. Without a word, Marta began pulling her coat back on. Leaving Lena to care for Madsen, Marta grabbed the longest coil of rope and handed one end to the terrified farmer. "Stay here. Yell if I stop pulling." She plunged back into the blizzard, a ghost moving through a white hell, her only guide the memory of Madsen's property line. It was an act of pure faith. She fought for every step, the wind trying to tear her from the earth. She found their cabin, a dark, silent shape in the maelstrom. Inside, Mrs. Madsen was huddled with her son, their faces blue with cold, their breathing shallow. The last of their fire was a plume of acrid smoke. Marta got them to their feet, half carrying the boy, and they began the treacherous journey back, a line of 3 desperate figures tethered to a fragile hope. They made it. They stumbled back into the impossible warmth of the Brandt cabin, joining the growing community of survivors. The next day brought more refugees. Preacher Davis arrived, led by the sound of their axe splitting what little dry wood they had left. He was humbled, his spiritual certainty shattered by the brute reality of the cold. He sat on the clay bench, soaking in the warmth, and looked at Marta. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet and raw. "I spoke from fear of what I did not understand. Your hearth, it is a blessing." He asked for no forgiveness, and she offered none. There was only the shared, life-giving heat. And then, as the storm began to lose its fury on the 3rd day, the final visitor arrived. Deputy Miller stood in the doorway, his face a mask of astonishment, completing the frame of their story. He stared at the scene, the calm sisters, the rescued families, the sleeping dog, the smell of fresh bread, and the great, warm heart of the room. The folly. The miracle. The storm finally broke. Days later, a path was cleared, and Land Agent Finch rode up, his face grim and purposeful. He had come to serve the eviction notice, to officially declare the claim abandoned. He dismounted and strode to the door, ledger in hand. He stopped on the threshold, his eyes taking in the same scene Miller had. He saw the Madsen family, alive. He saw Preacher Davis. He saw the steam rising from a pot of soup on the hearth. His gaze swept the room, noting the neatly stacked firewood, the full pantry shelves visible through an open door, the general air of order and improbable life. He said nothing. He did not apologize for his prediction or acknowledge his error. He simply opened his ledger, uncapped his inkwell, and drew a firm, black line through his previous entry. He made a new note, stamped it with his official seal, and tore the page out. He handed it to Marta. "Provisional status revoked," he said, his voice flat, transactional. "Title granted." He turned and walked away without another word. It was not redemption. It was an administrative correction. But it was enough. The young farmhand, Ben, never paid his $20 wager. But weeks later, he was seen at the Madsen place, silently helping Gregor mix a new batch of clay, his movements clumsy but earnest as he learned to build a hearth of his own. The valley learned. That spring, Gregor stayed, and under his and Marta's guidance, 6 masonry heaters were built before the next winter. The designs were refined, adapted to the local clay, but the principle remained the same. The knowledge, once mocked, became the new wisdom. The story of Brandt's folly became the story of the Brandt hearth, a local legend whispered with reverence. And in the quiet moments between the work, 2 romances bloomed. Lena and Gregor, the master mason, found their connection in shared competence, a love built on mutual respect and the solid foundation of a well-built flue. They were married by Preacher Davis the following summer, standing before the hearth that had, in its own way, brought them together. Marta's path was quieter, more poignant. She and the Madsen boy, Thomas, found solace in each other's company. They had both been touched by the deep cold of loss, and in the warmth of her home, they found a way to heal. Their marriage was an act of quiet defiance against the hungry ghost of winter, a promise of life that honored the memory of the brother he had lost. The leather-bound notebook was passed from Marta to Lena's eldest daughter, a girl with her great-great-grandmother's eyes. New notes were added in a flowing English script, detailing firing times for the local pine and the best sand-to-clay ratio from the creek. The book thickened with the knowledge of a new generation in a new land. Barrow, the brindle dog, lived a long and happy life, chasing rabbits in the high meadow and sleeping on the warmest part of the bench. He died in his sleep one autumn evening and was buried under an aspen tree. Thomas carved a simple stone for him, Barrow. A good dog. Marta grew old. Her hair turned the color of winter snow, but her hands were never cold. She lived to see her grandchildren have children of their own, all of them raised in the steady, radiant warmth of the clay hearth. On the last night of her life, surrounded by her family, she asked her youngest great-granddaughter to help her to the hearth. She placed her frail, wrinkled hand against the smooth, warm clay, the same place she had touched it all those years ago. She smiled, a distant, knowing look in her eyes. "The clay holds the heat," she whispered, and then she was gone. Stop here, at the end. Think about the things we inherit. Not just land or money, but the weight of a book passed through hands, the precise angle of a flue, the feel of wet clay, the memory of a voice whispering a simple, profound truth. Think of the knowledge that lives not in libraries, but in muscle and memory, in the earth beneath our feet. What is a legacy? Is it a name carved in stone, or is it the quiet, persistent warmth that shields a family from the cold? Do you feel the warmth that outlasts the fire? The clay holds the heat. Do you hear the wisdom of those who built before you, their hands shaping the earth to protect their children? The clay holds the heat. Do you understand that the coldest winds cannot extinguish a truth that is held, and shared, and passed down with loving hands? The clay holds the heat.